to thank you for coming today to the MSU Science Festival. Have you had a good time today? Have you learned something new? Have you been inspired? Awesome. Before I introduce Astronaut Casada, I just wanted to give a shout out to all of the volunteer presenters, general volunteers, our UOE staff, and my team of Catherine Hegman and Karina Van Hamlin, who all together we've put on this science festival and are able to keep it free for all of you to learn and enjoy. I also wanted to give a shout out to our sponsors because without them we couldn't do this, and they are University Outreach and Engagement, the Lansing State Journal, WKAR Family, Delta Dental, WILX Channel 10, the DART Foundation, FRID, Cyclotron, and K-12. So thank you to our sponsors. All right, now, why are you guys here? You don't want to hear from an astronaut, do you? All right, well, it is my extreme honor to be able to introduce astronaut Josh A. Casada. He was selected as an astronaut by NASA in 2013. His astronaut candidate training included intensive instruction in International Space Station systems, spacewalks, robotics, and T-38 flight training. He was commissioned as a naval officer in 2000, earning his wings of gold as a naval aviator in 2001. Astronaut Casada has accumulated more than 2,700 flight hours in 40 different aircraft. That's incredible. 40 aircraft, really?
Not at the same time.
And he flew over 23 combat missions, including Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom. Thank you for your service. He's also the recipient of many honors and awards, including the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, and he currently serves in the International Space Station Integration Branch, working issues in support of station crews. So, with further ado, I do have one shout out. I'm supposed to ask you something about the goose.
Oh, yeah. There's a goose story that's for after the talk, for sure. That actually probably get referenced. First of all, I just dropped my stuff off in the room next door, and I heard that the previous presenters were doing explosions, and then there was an applause. Where I come from, we don't clap when there's an explosion. So I set the bar right there. I'm a commander in the United States Navy. In my previous life, I did hydrogen physics. But now I'm at NASA, and interestingly enough, my NASA career had somewhat of a humorous start right here in Michigan about 5 years ago. But you need to know the background to that. My wife is from Charlottesville, Michigan, up here, north of Traverse City. And she and I, when we were just dating, we lived in Chicago. And I told her, I said, look, you don't ever need to worry about this, but someday I might apply for this job, and I'm interested in it. And she turned to me and she said, if you ever drag me to Houston, Texas, I get a pool. And of course I said, sure, thinking that was a safe bet. So if we fast forward 13 years, I was on campus at a rival Big Ten school, just 50 miles southeast of here. And I got a phone call, and the conversation went something like this. Hey Josh, this is Janet Gavandi, Director of Flight Crew Operations at NASA. How would you like to come down to Houston and be an astronaut? And apparently my response was, oh crap. And of course she said, excuse me? I said, Janet, I cannot afford a pool. And she said, I have no idea what you're talking about. So now my kids have a pool, but they're going to have to pay their way through college, for sure. And so that's how it all got started. I was in Ann Arbor using a lab there. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But first I'm going to start, the main reason you invite astronauts to come speak, right? We have stickers and we have cool videos. I've got stickers we can talk about later. Not too many. There's certainly not enough for this group. But I'm going to show you a video here that just kind of sets the tone, honestly, of how a lot of our days go. Minus all the email and the meetings. But the first half is the training that we tend to go through, and then the second half is on-orbit operations and application of that training. So hopefully... someday being able to watch that video and not just get goosebumps. But honestly, I've never been able to do it. It's just amazing what we can all do when we get on the same page and work together. So what I'm going to talk about today, I've been asked to talk a little bit about how I got here, and I'm not real crazy about talking about myself, so we'll keep that fairly quick. But happy to answer any questions, of course. Then we'll talk about the training that we go through in order to be able to do that. And then we'll talk about some of the cool science, at least just some of my favorite experiments that are on orbit right now, or soon to be. And then we'll talk about what we're doing next as a space agency and as a planet in terms of space exploration. So I'm from Minnesota primarily. I was a Navy brat. We moved around a lot. And after high school, I went to Albion College just down the road. We used to say the best thing about Albion, it's got less than 2,000 students, right? So the best thing about Albion is that you know everybody. And the worst thing about Albion is you know everybody. Actually, the 1995 class of physics majors, we have 50% of them here today. Where's Zach? Is Zach here? Okay, we're down to 25%. Zach's a good buddy of mine. He's the one who came up with the idea of bringing me up here from Houston to do this. And it's really special to me because this is where I got my start. Classroom size was literally the four of us, typically. That's some world-renowned physicist who's just done incredible work, but is now devoted to teaching. And so they were all males at that time, so he would always pick the pace that worked best for our group, and we're still all really tight right now. After Albion, I went to University of Rochester in upstate New York, and amazingly enough, I have my office mate. I shared an office for 3 or 4 years with Dr. Kirsten Tolfson, right here in the front row. So really small world. I did my coursework in upstate New York, and then moved to Chicago, where I worked at Fermilab and did particle physics, and we'll talk about that in just a second. That's where the math gets a little bit more complicated because after finishing my PhD at Rochester, I joined the Navy, and we moved around a bit now. So at this point now, we're in Houston. We've been there for 5 years. It's as long as we've ever been anywhere, and that means we're just building up a bunch of junk, and we need to move just to get rid of all that stuff. So real quick, where I cut my teeth in research, this is a picture of Fermilab. It's about 40 miles west of Chicago. Back then, it was the cutting edge of high-energy physics. So the particle accelerator itself is about 4 miles in circumference. It's about 20 feet underground. And what we did there was we collided protons and antiprotons. Coming up with protons isn't that hard. You start with a hydrogen gas and you ionize it, and then you strip off the electron and you're left with a proton. The limiting factor tended to be the p-bars, the antiprotons. The way we got those, we take this beam of protons, send it at a target. In this case, it was tungsten, and then you just sift off all the antiprotons and get rid of all the other garbage. So you end up with a bucket of antiprotons and a bucket of protons, and we collided them at nearly the speed of light. And when I do that, I'm doing this with 3 fingers, and the idea is, in high school we're taught that atoms are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons, and the story kind of ends right there. But now we know that protons and neutrons are built up of a substructure called quarks. And so we've got a set of 3 quarks headed at another set, and then we're looking at a quark-quark interaction. And so where we saw that was, this is Kirsten and I were on this same experiment together. This is the collider detector at Fermilab. It's really a synthesis of a bunch of different kinds of detectors. But the idea is that a collision that looks not unlike this happens at the center, and we record everything that comes out from that collision. And one of my favorite analogies for high-energy physics came from one of our professors at Rochester, and he used the analogy of a wristwatch. But he was German, so it was Bach. But the idea is, if you want to know how your wristwatch works, and you have to be over 35 to have a wristwatch, I understand these days, but if you want to know how this thing works, you're going to use a small screwdriver, take it apart, and investigate the inner workings of the watch. But if you don't have a small enough screwdriver, you really only have one option, and that's to take 10,000 of these watches, one at a time, and smash them on the wall. And every time you smash it, collect all of that information that comes out, and eventually you're going to be able to piece back together what was going on inside the watch and how it works. And so that's what we do in high-energy physics, and that's how we understand the very nature of nature. And that's what we were pursuing, and what we still pursue in fundamental physics. Why is the astronaut talking about high-energy physics, right? That is not why you guys are here. But I would argue it actually is, right? This is why we do science, whether it's at the subatomic scale or whether it's at the galactic scale. We are explorers. And if we already knew the answer, we wouldn't have the motivation to spend the time and the effort and the money and the risk to go and explore in these different regimes. So we're not doing anything unlike high-energy physics down at NASA. We're just doing it on a different scale. So maybe to preempt the question that I might get, I get this question a lot. It's from a certain sector of society, and it's, what am I going to get from space exploration? What is the return on investment for me? And my answer to that question is, I don't have a clue. But I can guarantee it's going to be super cool. And this has been true throughout history, right? 100, 150 years ago, cutting edge science was mechanics and thermodynamics. The reason people were doing that was because they were curious about how the world worked. But the fallout, 30 or 40 years later, is the Industrial Revolution. It's transportation, it's cars, it's airplanes. It has an incredible effect on commerce. But that's not why they were studying mechanics and thermodynamics. Same thing applies to quantum mechanics. Right? In the mid-40s, we had these giant computers with 20,000 vacuum tubes used to do trajectory analyses for artillery. The only people who could afford that were governments. People were curious about quantum mechanics. They developed a transistor, a really clever application of that, put supercomputers in everyone's pocket in this room. They weren't doing quantum mechanics because they wanted to build an iPhone or they wanted to build the internet. It just happened to fall out. So, at least that's my 2 cents. That's why we do science. It's to do something that we don't know the answer to, but we're going to go find out. Okay, so enough about that. So like I said, after physics, I wouldn't say I left physics. I'm hoping it was just a hiatus, and I'll go back to it. But I joined the Navy. I flew anti-submarine warfare. I was actually in the first, I was over land Iraq when the war first kicked off in 2003. There aren't a lot of submarines in the Middle East, I don't know if you know that. But what we used the P-3 for was for what's called intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR. So it's got a suite of sensors that we can use for multiple reasons. And so what we were able to do is use that to find the bad guys or find where the bad guys are shooting from. And you know, it tends to put life in perspective when you're overland Iraq and you're talking to a group of Marines who haven't slept in a couple days, and you have to relay the bad news that they just can't bed down right there because there's bad guys just around the hill. But that was how we used it during the war. And then my next appointment was to what was called Westpac. I was in Japan when the tsunami right at the end of 2004 hit Sumatra. Again, using the P-3 not for anti-submarine warfare, not for what we were trained to do, but rather to find displaced persons in Sumatra and get the assets and the helicopters to the field, get them safely home. After that, I went to test pilot school, became a test pilot. Navy was very good to me. Let me fly a bunch of different things. I got to fly the U-2. That was really awesome. And then at the end, I got to be the lead test pilot out in Seattle doing the acceptances for the new P-8. So this is a brand new aircraft that we bought from Boeing. So as part of the test team that put that together, and then we bought them on behalf of the government. And that's to replace my original platform, the P-3. So the Navy was so good to me. But I kind of saw where that was going to go, and so got a little crazy with another one of those Albion physics grads, and we decided that we would start a company. So we started a real small company. It's now in Novi. I don't have any role in it anymore, but we built single photon detectors. Not my background. As you've never heard the phrase quantum optics. I didn't do any kind of quantum optics. I never worked in a nanofabrication facility. But the guy I worked with, Aaron Miller, just a brilliant guy. Well, not that brilliant because he trusted me to go in there and work with tools. But the idea was, I've got enough of a physics background to understand it, and got enough of an aviation background to be able to read a manual and go figure out the tool. So we did. We built single photon detectors. Applications tended to be for very specific quantum mechanics analyses in academia. But now those applications are growing, things like quantum cryptography. And in fact, actually, NASA is working with the company to increase data rates for optical communications out in space. So it's really cool. That's why I was in Ann Arbor when I got the phone call to come to NASA. This is the group of astronauts who were selected with me. There are 8 of us, 4 men, 4 women. And what's really cool about this picture, at least to me, is that the question I got a handful of times earlier today, how do you become an astronaut? What do you have to do? This picture shows you we have no clue. Everybody comes from a different background. We've got an Air Force flight test engineer. We've got an Army medical doctor. We've got a civilian scientist who did physiology on animals, high-flying geese and penguins. We've got an electrical engineer. We've got, next to me is Nicole Mann. She is an F-18 Marine Corps fighter pilot who happened to be an outgoing student when I had come back to instruct at the test pilot school. It's a piece I left out, but I instructed at the test pilot school for a while. So she and I overlapped there, so we've known each other for quite a while. We have an Army helicopter pilot, and then we've got one more F-18 test pilot. So just a very diverse background for each of these amazing people. Okay, so we got there, 2013. We had 2 years to get it figured out. 2 years of focus just on training, which now that I'm realizing that I don't do that anymore, that was really great. Now I have to train and do and earn a paycheck. So, we'll talk about it more in detail. But this is the International Space Station. This is the only game in town right now. And this is where we will go. Again, I'm a year and a half or 2 years away from this, but we need to know this vehicle just like we know our jet. We need to know it inside and out. It's an incredibly complex vehicle. In fact, the most expensive thing humans have ever built. We've done that collectively, internationally, and we'll talk more about those relationships. So we need to know, we're going to have to understand the power source, architecture. We need to understand the computing, the communications, the thermal cooling. It's just it's an amazing, amazing machine. I put this up here just as a couple shots of some classmates going through some training in some of our mock-ups that we have in Houston. 2 reasons. I'm pretty sure that the flight dock has the electrical diagram upside down in the middle picture. But more importantly, on the right, that's what's cool about NASA. They can even make dealing with the toilet look cool, right? That's what that can is. And, you know, honestly, that kind of stuff is what makes human spaceflight very hard, being human. And you never want to say, hey, we had to deorbit the space station because we had nowhere to go to the bathroom. So we can talk more about the details of how we do that and how we do it really intelligently. We also need to learn Russian. I could speak Russian a lot better 2 years ago than I can now. But the idea here is, hey, we are an international collaboration. So beyond just the crew dynamics of being able to speak your crewmate's language and he or she can speak yours, it's also important operationally. You can imagine in the case of an emergency, and we train for emergencies all the time, you can imagine during an emergency needing to be able to speak someone else's native tongue can be very useful if there's a breakdown in communication to be able to hop into that other language. And that's what we do as we're dealing with, there are 3 main emergencies that make for a really, really bad day on the space station. And it's a fire, and it's a top atmospheric condition where we get ammonia into the cabin. And then the third one is a depressurization of the station. So you don't have a lot of time to be dealing with the inefficiency of a language barrier. So we learn Russian. Then we have this thing we call expeditionary training. This is where we go and put people in a situation that isn't quite comfortable. It's a little bit outside at least their comfort zone. Typically ending up in places that you couldn't ever get to with Marriott points. This is a shot of our class up in the Navy Survival School. It's actually called SEER, Survival, Evasion, Reconnaissance, and Escape. I'm sorry, Resistance and Escape. So when we went up there, it's just survival, right? We don't need to train astronauts on how to be POWs and deal with that kind of treatment. But I will say, when we first got up there, 8 brand new astronauts show up in northern Maine, and we meet the staff of SEER, and I meet this guy, and I said, boy, I remember you, and you weren't nearly this nice to me 12 years ago. Because he was focused more on the other letters besides the survival part of it. But really the idea here is being able to do your job in an uncomfortable situation, and honestly, most importantly, not be a jerk, right? So here's another environment that we use. This is called Nemo. This is an underwater habitat off the coast of the Florida Keys. where we lived for a couple weeks at a time as a crew, living very much like you do on the space station. In fact, we do an analog of spacewalks where we go out and do, no kidding, research, marine biology research for graduate students there in Florida. And then this is a shot of me saying hi to my buddy Chell last summer when he was down there, and I just checked in on him. And then we also go and use different programs that our international partners have. This is an example. This is a CAVES program that we have in Sardinia that has been put together mostly by the Italian Space Agency. Like we mentioned, we fly the T-38. T-38 is it's a handful of an airplane, but everybody flies it. It doesn't matter if you came to NASA from a military aviation background or not. The only difference is if you're a fixed wing test pilot, you'll sit in the front seat. Otherwise, you'll sit in the back seat. The only difference is that the backseaters don't do a takeoff and they don't do a landing. Otherwise, they are fully qualified in the T-38. It's interesting, the T-38 is one of the very few things that we do in our training that is not simulated. Everything else we do tends to be simulated. And if we have a problem, if we make a mistake, we can sit down, we can talk about it, we can debrief it, learn from it, and move on. T-38 is different. If you make a mistake here, you're going to pay for it. And that's what's really important to using it. We all have our list of 20 or 30 things on our to-do list. But when the pressure's on, you need to be able to quickly prioritize what's important. And that's the foundation that the T-38 builds. It allows you to build that foundation for somebody who's never actually had to do that, and always had the luxury of having extra time. This one I included just because it was fun. That's my friend Nicole, who I pointed out in that earlier picture of her class. We found ourselves on the flight schedule in late August when the eclipse happened, and so we grabbed a couple jets and tried to outrun it, and we lost in a big way. But we got some great photos. Robotics, that's another thing we have to get trained in. So what you're looking at there, that's the Canadian arm, or the Canada arm on the front of the space station. And that's Karen Nyberg operating the arm. Just depending on your perspective, hanging upside down. Her head is pointed at the earth, and she's hanging there in the cupola doing that. We use the robotic arm for a variety of reasons. One is we drive it out, we grab a cargo vehicle that has recently flown up, we grab it, we plug it into the space station, and we go get all the supplies and experiments that are in there. We also use it for rearranging the space station. We, at times, will disconnect the space station and rearrange it and put it back together in a new, more effective orientation, just like Legos. A little bit more complicated than Legos. And we'll also use it for this. I just think this is a super cool picture. When we do EVAs or spacewalks, which I'll talk about in a second, sometimes it's impossible to get the spacesuit into the position you need to get the work done. So we'll put a spacewalker at the end of the arm and then drive that person to the location to do the work. And you can see somebody, I think this might be Peggy Whitson, doing a repair on one of the giant solar arrays that we couldn't scale up to. If you tried to shimmy up the solar array, you'd destroy it on the way up. So pretty cool technology that Canada provided for the space station. So here's this acronym EVA, extravehicular activity. It just means going out the door and fixing something that's broken or upgrading something that's already there. Or installing maybe a new experiment. It's just like your house. Things break. You find yourself having to devote a weekend to going outside and fixing it. The difference is we don't even do a good job of hiding our smiles when something breaks, because now we get to go outside and do a spacewalk. It's a lot of work, not only for the on-orbit crew, but especially for mission control down in Houston. But it's amazing that we can make that whole choreography work. It's just it's an amazing thing to be a part of. This is where we do our training for spacewalks. This is, some people debate, the largest body of water, indoor, outdoor, I don't know. It's a giant pool. It's 100 feet by 200 feet by 40 feet. Over 6 million gallons of water. And we put as much of the space station in there that we could fit. It's not even actually that much of it. The solar arrays don't even barely exist in there. And it doesn't even fit contiguously. So you have to as you're translating along a piece of the space station, you get to a point where you say, okay, now I'm going to pretend, I'm going to take my hands off, the divers swim me over to a new spot, and now I'm going to magically reappear on a piece that should have been connected, but it just doesn't fit in the pool. So what they do is, there's an army of divers that are on us. We're in the pool maybe once a month or so. I was just in last week. And what we're doing is we're building the skills that we need to go out the door. Sometimes it's specific. Hey, this is how we're going to do actually this, what we call an R&R, which is a replacement of a box. Sometimes it's just building generic skills because we don't know what's going to break before we get up there, of course. So you just need to have your tool set available. But these army of divers will be swimming around me and they'll be tweaking the weight on my body or on my spacesuit to ensure that the spacesuit stays neutrally buoyant and doesn't float, doesn't sink in the pool. So that's about as good as we can do at mimicking weightlessness here on the planet. It has its limitations, of course, right? If I start moving this giant, we call it an ORU, but a big box, it's the size of a refrigerator, it weighs 1,500 pounds, of course in space it's weightless. If I go to move that in the pool, it takes quite a bit to get it going, and then I can stop it on a dime. If I try that in space, it's going to get going in a hurry, and then it's going to take me into a retrograde orbit, and I'm going to go flying off the space station. Right? So that's one of the limitations that we have to keep in mind when we're doing this kind of training. The other stuff is the suit itself might be neutrally buoyant in the water column, but I'm not. So last week, I did a lot of my work inverted. Well, I'm going to be heads down, all the blood going to my head. I've got a lot of pressure on my shoulders. By the way, we do a lot of damage to shoulders in the astronaut course, so we spend a lot of time doing shoulder exercises. If anybody was over at IM West last night, that's what I was doing. It does have its limitations, but it is a phenomenal training aid to allow people to go out the door who have never done a spacewalk ever and go out and absolutely crush it. This video, this is my really good buddy Reed Wiseman. This is between his two spacewalks. He went to space in 2014. He's another Navy guy like me. But he's commenting on and kind of describing what he experienced when he did the spacewalk. I want you to pay particular attention to what he says when he goes to open up the hatch and looks out at the Earth. And then if you pay really close attention, you'll hear when they show the video, they cut to his actual audio of going out the door, and you can hear him talk about how excited he is to be outside.
But the thing that I remember the most about yesterday was the very first impression I had is I opened the hatch just the way I was pointing. I had to open the hatch while Alex was working some of our oxygen controls back here. And so as I got that hatch open back there, the Earth below us it was nighttime, but the Earth was illuminated by the moon really well. So I could see the clouds rushing by. And as I opened that hatch, as a human being, I saw the darkness and I felt like there should have been this cold air draft coming in. I'm really excited for you to get out here. And I'm ready to.
So if I'm on orbit and you guys read about something that's broken on the outside, you know my response is. All right, so we've got this International Space Station. Why the heck do we have it? NASA probably is not real crazy about me saying this. But in my mind, honestly, and I'm saying this as a scientist and as a physicist, the number one reason we have the International Space Station isn't necessarily science. It is to get really, really good at living and working in space. Because if we as a society ever decide that we want to leave low Earth orbit and we want to go to deep space, we want to go to the moon, we decide we want to go to Mars, there's only one way to do that, and that's to get really good at living in space. Right now, we only live 250 miles away from the planet. That's really close. That's here to the north end of the Manhattan Bridge. That is not that far. But we're in space, and it's hard, and if something goes wrong, we can probably get ourselves back if we have to. However, we have this giant space station, which is a super cool laboratory. So we do science too, but from my perspective, the number one reason is this. So like I said, here is LEO, low Earth orbit, 250 miles. That means we're going around the planet at 17,500 miles an hour. So we see a sunrise and a sunset every 90 minutes going over around the planet. You can imagine what that does to your circadian rhythms. We were talking just a couple minutes ago. A lot of people, and I'm sure I'm going to do it too, you just decide, you know what, I'm going to be tired for 6 months. Because at the end of a long work day, you go hang out in the cupola. That's this part that's hanging out from the bottom. We'll be able to see it in this next video. With us looking at the planet, you do this amazing photography, or you just sit and watch. And then you go to sleep for about 6 hours because your brain is just so fired up. This should be a video of a fly around of the space station, so I'll just talk about the space station a little bit. This is actual video of a vehicle flying around the space station, so you'll see somebody's going to jostle the camera here a little bit. Like I said, international collaboration. Right here on the front of the space station, I'll use this pointer here. Right here on the front of the space station, you kind of imagine it flying out of the screen right now. This is the Japanese modules. Here's the European module. All of this here is what we call the USOS, or the US segment. And then in the back here, we've got the Russian segment. It is truly an international collaboration, to the point that if the US or the Russians were to pull out, we can't fly the space station anymore. The US, NASA, are in charge of the solar arrays here that provide all the power that we need for the station. We also maintain the attitude of the station. And that's incredibly important, not only for pointing those solar arrays in the right spot to generate the right power and to shed the right amount of heat, but also to be pointing at the right angles for teacher satellites, for communications, all kinds of reasons. But the problem is, we use these giant gyros. They're about 500-600 pounds a piece. We have 4 of them. And so by conservation of angular momentum, we can keep using those gyros to maintain the attitude of the station right where we want it. But there's a point at which we call it saturated, where these gyros are saturated and all the angular momentum vectors are completely aligned. So they're not doing us any more good. So what we need is we need the hand of God to come out and hold the space station right where it is, and then we reposition those gyros. The Russians provide that hand of God. That aft section of the space station has thrusters and propellant just enough to hold us in place so we can reposition those gyros. Interesting thing about the space station, all these pieces never assembled on the ground. They were all flown up piecemeal on the back of the space shuttle. We had the space shuttle. Space shuttle guys don't like this, but the space shuttle was a pickup truck. Its mission was to build the space station. Right? All those modules fit perfectly in the back of the space shuttle. But it's super expensive, pretty dangerous. So when we were done with the space station, we were done with the space shuttle. It's about the size, at least the habitable volume, this part where we live here, it's about the size of a 6-bedroom house, which is great. We tend to have about 6 people up there. It isn't actually 6 bedrooms. We all sleep in closets. And in fact, the cool thing is you can use not only the walls for like what we call crew quarters where we sleep, or for experiments, but you can also use the floor and the ceiling. It's a 6-bedroom house that has a lot more real estate than a typical 6-bedroom house. I'm going to go back just to show the picture one more time. So our closets, there's 4 of them all together, and one will be on the starboard, zenith, port, and on the deck. And so you just go into your little closet, you pull it, and you go in there to sleep. And, some of the things that we have to deal with are, we're humans. We're used to having our head on a pillow. Some people will bring a pillow and kind of strap it to the side of their head, just to have that feeling. It's not doing them any good, but it's just something they're used to. Or you get snuggled into like a sleeping bag and get yourself kind of snugly into the corner as best you can. We say that the space station is about the size of a football field. We mean from one side to the other side of the solar arrays, but again, this is the only part we can live in right here. That's all I got on that, but I'm sure we get more questions. So this is the part about living and working in space. This is Kevin Ford. He's working on what we call ARED, that's Advanced Resistive Exercise Device. And I just pulled that out. But what he's doing is he's lifting weights. Of course, lifting weights in space is incredibly easy. So we don't lift weights. We have these vacuum canisters in this exercise setup. And then it's got flywheels in it too to give us the inertia that we're used to from lifting weights. So we need to do, we can do squats, we can do curls, we can do bench press, we can do everything here. And it's not that everybody's super into fitness in space, but we work out 2 to 2.5 hours a day. And the reason is we're super lazy the other 22 hours out of the day. The body doesn't need to do anything. In fact, before we started working out like this, we would lose up to 2% of bone mass every month. So you can imagine going for 6 months, you're going to be a mess when you get back. Not to even mention the muscle atrophy that you've had. We're now down to well under 0.5% a month in bone mass. The things we're investigating now are the quality of the bone, as opposed to just the mass itself. We're doing things like, just recently, we're growing our own veggies, which is super exciting to get something fresh on orbit. So this is Chell and Scott Kelly eating lettuce that they grew during their expedition. We also have issues with ocular health. About 20% of astronauts have an issue with their vision when they get back. There are different theories on this. It might be because the CO2 is so high, and it is. It's very high in the space station. CO2 is very hard to get rid of, and that's, again, one of the technologies that we need to figure out before we try to go out to Mars on a two-year mission. One of the other theories might be the intracranial pressure. When you're in space, your fluids are going to be in different places, and so you can see people get fat heads. They do their first interview, and we're all laughing at them because it looks like their head's about to pop. But it's because you've got more pressure in your head, so some people are thinking maybe that's what's causing these ocular issues. So that's the living and working in space piece. If I've got a minute, I'd love to run through just a couple experiments that I personally find cool. There are 300 or 400 experiments that are on orbit at any one time. There are investigators all over the globe coordinating these experiments. This is one, I'm biased just because Kate's a really good friend of mine. Kate flew about 1.5 years ago. She's a molecular biologist. She's the first person to have sequenced DNA in space. She tells me that's a super big deal, and I believe her. So she sequenced a ground prepared sample. So now we're at the point where we can now sample, prepare, and sequence in space. And that has incredible applications, whether it's environmental monitoring, right? You can't have bugs up there. There's nowhere to go. People start getting sick. So to be able to do those samples in situ is really important. Research itself, to be able to do research on humans or animals or microbes or plants, we can do that right there. And then real-time medical applications. You can imagine somebody comes down with something and the docs would love to be able to sequence what's going on, and we can do that. And then finally, we're developing this technology so that hopefully not too far down the road, we can start sequencing DNA using a rover remotely. We can send this thing out to Mars and sequence DNA in Mars before we even go ourselves. So really cool stuff that we just recently started doing. This one, you got to give me a little latitude. This one's my favorite. This is called the Alpha Magnetic Spectrometer. This thing is parked on top of the space station, and it was proposed by somebody in the high energy physics field, a Nobel laureate named Dr. Sam Ting. And the cool thing about this one to me is its poetic justice. When I was at Albion, in the mid-90s, this one there was a story that crushed me. I was really interested in high energy physics. The cutting edge of high energy physics for probably the next 100 years was going to be the superconducting super collider. It was going to be in Texas. It was over 50 miles in circumference. It was going to blow the doors off of anything that we hope to do in the near future. Well, the SSC was canceled. It was actually canceled a couple times. They turned it back on and canceled it again. And the reason is, there was twofold. One, they said it was over budget, which I take a little bit of issue with because it was underfunded for many, many years. And if you underfund something on order of decades, it's going to be over budget because once you integrate that out, it's going to be expensive. It turns out it wasn't even that much over budget. The big issue from Congress was they needed to cancel a program in Texas. And there's a congressman who said, I can see what we're going to learn about the universe from the ISS, but I don't see what we're going to learn from a collider. So they canceled the superconducting super collider and they funded the International Space Station. Really, really interesting answer from Sam Ting to put a high energy physics experiment right on top of the space station. It can't fly by itself. It requires too much power, so you couldn't have it just be its own satellite. It has to be on something as massive as the space station. It's interesting, it was only supposed to be up there for a couple of years. The idea of the AMS is just sifting cosmic rays. It's just kind of looking. And it's got two missions. One is it's looking for dark matter. Some of the most popular theories out there for dark matter end up producing a lot of positrons. So that's why this picture is super cool. Of course, a lot of people are debating it, but as a high energy physicist, and I think even Kirsten, even if she's not a big fan of the AMS, would agree, as a high energy physicist, whenever you see a bump, that means, hey, that's a new particle. And so what's happening here is you just have to trust me that this is super exciting. This is how many positrons we expect this blue line should be dropping off here. The more energetic the particle, the fewer we should have. What's really happening is they're finding an abundance of positrons in a certain energy regime. It just means there's something there, most likely. Maybe it's dark matter, maybe it's something different, but we very well may have found new physics. It's just really cool for high energy physicists. The other thing the AMS does is it looks for antimatter, right? We're in a matter universe. If the Big Bang is true, there should be a whole antimatter universe somewhere else, and we can't find it. So it's looking for anti-helium. It's just sitting out there waiting to see. And in fact, about a year and a half ago, it's now still under review. A lot of people are looking at it. But there seems to be a hint of antimatter that has just showed up in the AMS. Anyway, it was only supposed to be up there for a couple of years. It's done some amazing things, so everybody's agreed, hey, we need to keep this thing running. The pumps are dying. So we are about to go out the door and fix something that Sam Ting, when we were at Fermilab, Sam Ting said astronauts will never need to touch. And as soon as he said that, I said, boy, I want the MS to break and I want to fix it. So right here, Congressman, I don't think my timing's going to work out quite right, but we're going to go out there and fix it, and we're going to add a new pump package for cooling. And that's just for cooling the central silicon detector of this thing. So that's the AMS. Just this week, right now actually, as we speak, the Cold Atom Lab is on a truck or a train or something on its way to the eastern seaboard of Maryland, on the eastern shore there. It's going to launch out of Wallace in May. And it's going to show up on the space station. And we'll probably start taking data hopefully as early as this summer. Super cool idea. Again, it is the coldest spot in the universe, is the tagline for it. And the idea is that we've got these atoms. I think they're doing it with rubidium and potassium. So we've got this cloud of atoms, and we take lasers from all these different directions to kind of reduce the temperature, right? That's just energy. and we just need to slow things down with those lasers. And then, kind of like you're blowing on a cup of coffee, we kind of knock off the more energetic atoms using an RF field. And then finally, we take this magnetic field and we squeeze everything down and then release it. And that's this adiabatic expansion, which gets us down colder than we can do here on the planet. And the reason is, when you hold it into a position and you squeeze it down, when you do that here, we have to fight 1G. You have to work a little bit harder to hold it. We don't have to do that in microgravity. All we have to do is squeeze it down, we let it go, and also it doesn't fall to the bottom of the experiment. So we've got an increased dwell time, meaning we can watch what's going on, and we can watch it longer, and it's actually colder. And so what does this mean? It's a Bose-Einstein condensate. It's this really cool idea that you get things cold enough that these atoms don't act independently. They start working together, kind of like dancers in a chorus line. All the kicks all going in unison. And so we're going to be able to watch and look at quantum mechanics on a macroscopic scale. That's just, I don't know. I really hope to get up there and see it. So those are a couple experiments that I'm excited about. There it is. This is moving now, completely shifting gears. How do we get to the space station? Right now, the only way to get there is the Russian Soyuz, launching out of Russia. This is just a shameless plug for my friend Kate. This was her launch. And I just thought this was a super cool picture that somebody who couldn't get in a spot to get a good picture got an even better one with the photographer. We tend to train in Russia for about a year or so, cumulatively over the 2 years that lead up to your launch. But like a lot of us have talked about earlier today, if you stop by, we are going to soon start launching commercial vehicles out of Cape Canaveral, out of Kennedy Space Center. And we have two companies that are doing that. We have Boeing and SpaceX. Should be launching people. Again, officially these dates move all over the place, but it's in the near future. And this is a pretty cool video that kind of walks you through it. So it is. It's just around the corner. I actually spent a lot of my days doing a lot of flight tests in the simulators as we were getting these vehicles ready to go. But these are our two commercial partners because we are focused. We can let Boeing and SpaceX primarily run those as we're actively involved, but then we work as the big NASA. We're working directly with Lockheed to do the next stuff, the deep space mission, and that's going to be on Orion. Which is the beyond low Earth orbit stuff, whether it's to the moon or into what we call a deep space gateway, which is orbiting the moon, and then eventually onto Mars. This rocket is incredible. This is it's called the SLS. It is bigger than the Saturn V. It is just a really, really remarkable machine. And what's really cool about this next video, if you guys have time for one more video? Okay. Yeah. What's really cool about this is not theoretical. Yeah, you're going to see some animation in there, but there's a lot of it that's actual metal getting cut. We already launched one at the end of 2014, at least the capsule. We launched the capsule on a different rocket. We'll be launching what's called EM1 in the next couple of years. That's going to be an unmanned vehicle that's going to go around the moon. It's going to be out there for 3 months. And then a couple of years after that, we're going to send our first cruise, deep space. I mean, these people are going to go further than we have ever been as a species, 40,000 miles beyond the moon before we're coming back. So this one's a really cool one too. And then we'll do some questions. Yeah, I promise. It's a really, really super exciting time to be at NASA. We'll take questions here in just a second. I just want to leave you with a quote. It's actually probably not even that well known. The director of Fermilab, the first director of Fermilab, was called to testify in 1965 in front of Congress. Did I say 65, 69? Late 60s. But you can imagine what kind of questions were important in 1969. And he was repeatedly asked how what we do at Fermilab, high energy physics, fundamental science, how that was going to help us beat the Russians, and how it was going to contribute to national security. And he was asked multiple times. And finally, he came up with this answer. It has nothing to do directly with defending our country, except to make it work.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to run this in the background. It's going to be super distracting, but I promise it's on a loop, it'll come back. This is what happens because we're up there 24 hours a day. When you have weekends free, this is what happens. So I stole some of this video so you can just watch these guys mess around while we ask questions if you want. It's up to you guys. If you have questions, I'm here to field them.
One more hand for Astronaut Casada. And your other 25% just came in the room. Questions? Way in the back there.
Okay, my question is, how does astronaut change your life as a human being?
How does being an astronaut change my life as a human being? For me, back to that other point from the very beginning, I am blown away, now that I'm in this position, what society can accomplish when we're not fighting against each other. Oh yeah, getting in a fight in space never works because you're going to hit the guy and go the other way. Oh, absolutely. Not only would we put our lives in these people's hands, we do routinely every day. Yep. So there's certainly it's a family. So the question was, do you always land at your intended destination, or do you sometimes land in a different country, or you miss? Yeah, we miss. It happens. So when the Soyuz comes in, you think of it as kind of a rock, right? It's coming in, but it actually has this center of mass that's a little bit offset, so you can drive where you're going and kind of move that lift vector a little bit down or a little bit up as you need to go hit your intended location. Well, when we have what's called a ballistic entry, which means something's gone wrong, you're spinning the whole way down, okay? And so that whole lift vector has been nullified, so you'll likely land short. I think it's on order of about 250, 300 miles. So thank goodness Russia is awfully good and not possible. It's happened a couple times. Yeah, but yeah, you age differently in space. So we do get a lot more radiation, or at least more radiation, up there than we are feeling here. But I like to think that that's offset by special relativity. Yeah, so we are limited on how many missions and how much time we can spend in space because of those radiation limits. I don't know, I like to tell all the guys that when they come back they look really old, so they'll get off the list and get out of my way. Yeah. Yeah. So we quarantine within a certain window of launch, and the only people that can interact with the crew have been cleared, and we get cleared, every single day before we go in. But yeah, they do it over in Russia. We'll do it over at the Cape. It's a pretty strict protocol that we've got to prevent that from happening. But if somebody were to get sick on launch day, we've got a backup crew. And then it gets really complicated. You switch the whole crew, you just switch that one person, and then there are international discussions to have because maybe you include an international partner but not a NASA partner. It's complicated. Yes? What do you eat in space? I left to my own devices, I'm going to eat a lot better in space than I do here. It's not all dry. You've got hot water dispensers that you can use to make some of the greatest food. Some of it's terrible. The nice thing is that we don't agree. So you get this big, what we call a bob. It's this giant bag of all these different foods. And the big problem is if you and your two crewmates all like the same thing, because then there's about 2/3 of it that you're just not going to get eaten. But the food's pretty good. Pretty good. I have a good friend who ate all the Lorna Doone shortbread up there and actually didn't leave any for the rest of us. Yeah, back there. You know what would be really great? A Roomba. We got to clean on the weekends, right? And we have a vacuum and we do all that kind of stuff. That would be super cool. A 3D Roomba. What's the temperature of space? Well, I think we say it's 3 or 4 Kelvin, but you're in the suit and you're actually, you maintain your temperature when you're out there while you're working. In fact, sometimes you get way too hot, and we got to turn up our cooling on the spacesuit itself. But it's interesting, you know, like I said, we're orbiting the planet every 90 minutes. So you'll be working on something in your spacesuit, and then you keep getting closer and closer and closer to it, and then you realize you had your dark visor down, and it's pitch black out. So you got to throw that back up and need a friend to remind you, hey, it's nighttime. You can take your sunglasses off. Yeah.
Why don't we use the shuttle anymore?
So the space shuttle was pretty expensive, really expensive. More expensive than we expected when we bring that back and reuse it. And it was also pretty dangerous. And it's a little bit like, you know, I use this analogy of a pickup truck. If you were going to drive across the country and your only job was to get your body from the East Coast to the West Coast, you probably wouldn't drive a pickup truck if you could shoot your car to be more fuel efficient. That's kind of the idea. You don't want to be getting 8 miles to the gallon when you could be getting 35 or 40. Yeah, way back.
Back to your question, the question about radiation. What is the plan for dealing with that when people are on longer trips, like to Mars?
Yeah, that's one of the big issues that we're wrestling with right now. You need to get shielding that isn't super heavy, and so that is one of the active issues that we're working. Again, not my. Yeah, way back.
Back to your question, the question about radiation. What is the plan for dealing with that when people are on longer trips, like to Mars?
Yeah, that's one of the big issues that we're wrestling with right now. You need to get shielding that isn't super heavy, and so that is one of the active issues that we're working. Again, not my expertise. I don't really know what Orion has in plan unless it's just, you actually can shield yourself from a lot just by all the stuff you need to bring anyway. You know, water itself is a great shield for radiation. Exactly. And we have, on station, we know when there's going to be a solar event. So if we need to, we shelter and we go to the right place in the station to minimize the amount of radiation we're going to get.
Put on spacesuits?
No space suits. No. What's the one?
Because like you're talking the SpaceX and stuff, where are those people going to go when they go up in space? They're just going to go up and then come right back down?
So the question was, where are the commercial partners like SpaceX and Boeing going to go? So SpaceX and Boeing, I'm sorry if I didn't make this clear, we're going to launch out of Kennedy Space Center, and we're going to go to the space station. So all these flights that we're doing out of Russia, now we can start kind of turning off that spigot, and we can start launching ourselves out of the cave. And I'll tell you, I'm pretty excited now to be pushing buttons that have Cyrillic on them. Yeah. So a little bit slower, right? This whole idea of special relativity, the time dilation, the faster you move, the slower your clock is ticking. But it's nothing measurable for us. I think somebody's done the math. It's a second and a half or something that we get from being up there for 6 months.
So you're a second and a half younger than all the rest of us in this room?
Well, I haven't done that yet. So we're all in phase right now. Yeah, but how does it feel? So again, I haven't gone yet, but I have a wife and 2 kids and 2 cats who all tend to sleep in the same bed, so I think I'm going to be okay. Have we had any major problems on station? Yeah, we have. And you know, some of them are really just the unknown, right? When you come into mission control and realize, you know, we've had a couple of instances where we've lost communication with the space station, and you realize, holy cow, they're on their own. What the heck's going on out there? We've had missions that we've lost some crew members on launching or returning from space, but on the space station itself, yeah, we've lost some crew members. No. I'm so glad you said that. My son asked me exactly that question because I used the phrase lost. And he was really mad at NASA for not going and getting these people and bringing them back. That's where I realized I made a big mistake by using the word lost. But yes. It was, yeah, go ahead. Nope, just in the movies. Just in the movies. Let's see, over here. So the question is, how long did it take to get back to normal after you've been in space for a while? That varies from person to person, of course. It also depends on what you've been doing while you were up there. But typically people are not back driving a car for a month or so. There are some, we have a policy at NASA that if you land on a Russian Soyuz in Russia, we're going to have you back in Houston within 24 hours, which is pretty cool. We've got 2 crews standing by to fly our Gulfstream 5, immediately pick up the crew, get them to Ireland. The next crew is about to get on a flight around the planet. People aren't feeling great. But then the next day, I'll see them in the gym. They'll be right in the gym trying to get their vestibular system back and working out. So typically a month, sometimes less, sometimes more. Yeah, but. So the question is, can you do an infinite number of those backflips? In theory, yeah. If there was no air resistance, yeah, you just keep going forever. How about I let you know? I bet that gets really confusing to your brain because you've got references that just keep getting more and more complicated and trying to process all that. Yeah, you got a whole weekend to put on your own. Yeah. The question was, when I was a kid, did I tell people I was going to be an astronaut? So initially, I was going to play Major League Baseball. My fastball topped out around 82 miles an hour. That's when I realized I needed to find a different job. And that was kind of my freshman year of college. I've been interested in the space program. I kind of got interested in late high school. But yeah, I mentioned to people, hey, to my wife, I said I'd be interested in doing this. I never really counted on it. In my mind, it's a little bit like playing the lottery. You can't win if you don't buy a ticket, but you better have a different retirement plan. Yeah, lean back. Off time in this vacation? What kind of games? That's an awesome question. So we've got this group, it's called Hunch. It's high school kids that put together hardware that we actually fly at the station, and they can often do it a lot cheaper than our commercial partners. And one of the programs was games. And I just saw this recently, things like kind of like 3D basketball, right? You got a hoop that hangs out, and we're for astronauts, so we're all going to be competitive about these kind of things. I've seen zero-G checkers, right? Which is a little bit like Legos, right? You got to get it to stay, otherwise that game's going to get messy in a hurry. Things like that. But we're astronauts, we'll turn anything into a game. It's, can I get to 250 milliliters to fill up this bottle? Oh, you went over, you lose, right? Way in the back, white shirt. Sorry, about that. Say it again. Did we leave a person out there? Can you lift a person? Yeah, you can lift really anything, right? It doesn't weigh anything, it just has mass. So the big issue is that you're stopping it. Once you get it figured, if it's too massive, it's going to be hard to stop. Yeah. So I haven't flown yet, but my longest mission is in that doggone P3. I was with a crew, we stumbled on a Chinese submarine, and so we had to start shutting down motors so we can stay on long enough until the next crew could come out and relieve us. So we were out there for almost 13 and a half.
All right, fellow travelers, back home from seeing the astronaut at the science fair. It was very entertaining. It was very informal. The only thing is I wanted to have a picture with him at the end, but they rushed him off very quickly. They should at least have the people have take a picture with him. But it was cool. I got some good pictures with him, and they even got an autographed picture of him. He seemed like a real nice guy. So, there you go. I'm going to make sure I put that up somewhere. It was a pretty cool event today. I would have recorded this ending, at the event, but my battery decided to die toward the end. And my phone didn't have enough storage to film everything, so so here we go. I got my home, got my phone, my camera plugged in. So here we go. Till next time, travelers. Till our next adventure. See you around the mitten.